In this video, let's talk about port isolation for UniFi switches. We will have 3 sections. The first one, let's talk about the most simple scenario. You only configure the port isolation using just one switch for different port situation, whether they can communicate with each other. Then we will move on to a more complex scenario. You have multiple UniFi switches, how you can configure the port isolation to make them work together. In the end, whether port isolation can be configured in backend using CLI, whether we have more features by using CLI. If you search port isolation on Wikipedia, you will find this article for private VLAN. It says private VLAN, also known as port isolation. But for UniFi switches, port isolation is not private VLAN or PVLAN. It's just a protect mode. Basically, the system will put multiple ports into one group and prevent them from communicating with each other. It sounds like the purpose of VLAN or firewall, right? But port isolation can work together with normal VLAN so that you can easily control two clients within the same VLAN, whether you want them to communicate with each other. Port isolation works on layer 2. Let's consider this very simple example. You have one UniFi switch. In this video, I'm going to use a USW24 ports switch as my testing device. So you have two clients, one connected to port 5, the other port 7. Then you have a server. Let's say you have a very simple requirement. You don't want client 1 and client 2 to communicate with each other, but they can still use the services in the network, for example, to access the server machine. So by default, every port has the isolation status disabled. Let's go to the system, check the different combinations when it comes to whether a port is isolated or not. Let's check whether they can communicate with each other. On the screen, you see 4 windows. These 3 are for the 3 testing Linux virtual machines. The top right one is for the server. The lower 2 are for client 1 and client 2. To simulate their communications, I'm going to simply use ping. In the top right window, let me access the network controller and show you the current port configuration for port 5, 7, and 21. This is the switch USW Pro 24. I'm in the port tab. So let's check port 5 first. Port profile override, port isolation disabled, port 7, the same situation, disabled, and port 21 disabled as well. All 3 of them currently have the isolation disabled. Then let's see whether they can communicate with each other. Of course they can, because this is just a default configured switch. I don't have any firewall rules or special VLAN configured. Let me find out their IP addresses, starting from the server. Client 1, client 2. They all have the same subnet from client 1. Let me ping client 2. Yeah, it's pingable. From client 2, ping client 1. And then from client 1, ping the server. From client 2, ping server. Okay, so they have no issues to ping each other, just as expected. Now let's start configure the port isolation. We are going to change the port isolation configuration using the network controller. Before that, check the left side diagram. See these 4 different combinations. In fact, we just tested the first combination. They can communicate without issues. Now let me only change one of the 2 ports, port 5 and port 7, to isolated. Let's see whether it will prevent their communications at all. Go to port 5, port 5 override, enable isolation, apply changes. This switch will show you the provision status. If you check the lower screen, they are still pinging each other without issue because, of course, the configuration is not effective yet. Now it is effective, but all pings, they still work fine. That's another confusion because the name port isolation implies once you enable it, the port will be isolated. In fact, it's not really behave like that. Only if you put 2 ports within one group, the isolation group, they will be isolated. Otherwise, they can still freely communicate with other parts. That's what's happening now. We just enabled port 5. Nothing's happened yet, right? Because port 7 is not in the same group as port 5. We just validated the second and the third combinations. Now let's proceed to port 7. Go to port 7 and switch on port isolation. Apply changes. So it is doing provisioning, and wait. You will see the effect right after it turns green. Okay, it's green, and see these two ping sessions, they are frozen. Wait for a while, you will see error. See the right side, they can still ping the server without any problem. Okay, see the left side, you already see error, and then the right side, yes, it's also reporting the same error. These two parts, port 5 and port 7, they have been successfully isolated. They cannot communicate with each other, but they can still access other services. This is a very simple application for port isolation. For example, think about a hotel. So let's say for each room, you have a Ethernet port. You want each room to be isolated with all other rooms. Of course, you can use more complicated network configurations, for example, VLANs, firewalls, right? But that's time consuming and that need regular maintenance. Another very simple way to do that is you simply set all the rooms ports as isolated. Then they simply cannot communicate with each other. Move on to the more complicated scenarios, which involve multiple switches. On Ubiquiti's website, there is a help document about guest portal and hotspot system. In the end, there is a diagram. The original purpose for Ubiquiti to introduce this diagram is to explain how to use port isolation to limit broadcast and multicast. But in this video, we can borrow this diagram, use the same idea. Let's test how to make port isolation work in multiple switches. This is the network diagram we are going to use for the second testing. There are 3 layers of switches. In the lowest layer, in the left side, I use a small PoE switch to power 2 UniFi access points, and I connect one Wi-Fi client to each AP. In the right side, I use another small switch to connect with 2 Linux virtual machines. In the middle layer, we have the so-called aggregation switch. In the highest level, I have another switch. It's connected to the aggregation switch and another Linux virtual machine as a server. We are going to test how we can configure port isolation to achieve the effect that for the 4 clients, 2 Wi-Fi clients, 2 desktop clients, they cannot communicate with each other, but they can all access the server. Let's see what we can do in the 3 different layers of switches. Let's confirm the network connection in the UniFi controller's topology display. So let's start from the right side. I already forced each Wi-Fi client to be connected to the designated AP. So Wi-Fi client wirelessly connected to AP1 and Wi-Fi client 2 connect to AP2. These 2 AP are connected to the first small PoE switch, 2 Linux virtual machines connected to the other small switch. They are both linked to the aggregation switch, connected to the upper level, the services switch. The third Linux virtual machine as a server is also connected to the upper level switch. If you compare this with the slide, you can confirm they are the exact same connections. Now let's go to the 4 clients. I have 2 Mac machines as Wi-Fi clients, 2 Linux virtual machines as desktop clients. Similar to what we did in the first local switch scenario, let's first launch several ping sessions between the different clients. From the Wi-Fi client side, I already displayed the Wi-Fi IP address. Let me start the ping. From Wi-Fi client 1, let me ping Wi-Fi client 2. Yeah, reachable. From Wi-Fi client 2, ping Wi-Fi client 1. Yeah, reachable. From desktop client 1, ping client 2. From desktop client 2, ping client 1. Yep, all 4 ping sessions work fine. Now let's start with the 2 Wi-Fi clients. Let's enable the port isolations. For access switch 1, we want to enable the port isolation for the 5th and 6th ports. Do it in the quick way. Select ports insights. Select both 5 and 6. Enable port isolation. Apply changes. Confirm. Wait. I expect these 2 ping sessions will start failing. Yep, as expected. Move on to the desktop clients. Enable the port isolation for the 2nd small switch. Ports insights. Select 5 and 6. Enable port isolation. Wait. Okay. They are frozen now. You can see the left side is starting reporting error. The right side will start as well very soon. Okay, for both Wi-Fi and wired connections, they work as expected. But see, we haven't done anything on the middle layer, the aggregation switch yet, which means these 2 parts, they are still not enabled with port isolation, right? Let's try to connect, let's say from Wi-Fi client 1, let me connect to desktop client 1. Let's see whether it works. From Wi-Fi client 1, ping IP address for the desktop client 1. Yep, it's still reachable. So even though we enabled port isolation in both this part and this part, it doesn't matter. As we mentioned, port isolation settings only work in the local switch. This part in the 2nd switch is not isolated with the part in the 1st switch. That's why they can still ping each other. Let's move on to the middle layer switch. Let's enable these 2 parts. Let's see what will happen. Let me leave this ping session here. This is the aggregation switch, the middle layer switch. The first 2 parts, they are the ones we want to enable port isolation. Go to port insight, select the first 2, enable port isolation, then wait. See, it's failed now. Port isolation settings are successful. All the 4 clients, they cannot connect with each other anymore. But let's see whether our clients, they can still access the server. Let me use the desktop client 2 as an example. Ping the server's IP address from the desktop client 2. Yep. Still reachable. This is how you want to enable port isolation in different switches, in different layers to achieve what you want. Now let's talk about the 3rd section of this video about CLI. We have been kept talking about isolation group. Basically on the UI, when you enable port isolation, what the system really does is it adds the port to a group. But what if I want to add different ports to different groups? Apparently from the UI, it's not achievable, but let's see whether we can do it from CLI. On the screen, you see a diagram. I'm going to try. I have 4 clients. They connect to 4 ports. I want to group the first 2 ports as group 1, last 2 ports as group 2. I don't want client 1 and 2 to connect to each other. I don't want client 3 and client 4 to communicate with each other, but client 1 can connect to either 3 or 4. Client 2 can also connect to 3 or 4. Vice versa. They are only isolated within their own specific group. UniFi switches inherited the CLI from Edge switch. If your switches are in the professional or enterprise product line, you can access the CLI using SSH. Everything about CLI is not permanent. Once the switch is restarted or gets provisioned from the UI, everything you change from CLI will be lost. We just want to try it temporarily from CLI. Let's see whether we can achieve something we cannot get from UniFi's graphical user interface. This is the screen layout I'm going to use. In the right side, let me SSH into it. So the way to use CLI is telnet to itself. En for enable, config for configure. As you can see in the lower left window, in the 2nd section of this video, we configured port 1 and 2 as port isolated. In the CLI, I expect to see the same information. Let me show the port isolation group 0. Yeah, I see port 1 and port 2, right? There are totally 3 groups. Let me display the other 2. Yeah, they are both empty. Now it's time to configure the other two groups which are not available from the graphical UI. Group 1, I want to add port 13 and 15. For group 2, port 17 and 19. To configure each interface, I need to first enter that particular interface. For example, interface 13. I say switch port protected, followed by the group ID. For port 13, I want to add it to group 1. Done. Then switch to port 15, add to the same group. Done. Interface 17. This time add to group 2 and switch to the last one, 19. Add to group 2 as well. So we are done. Before we check from the Linux and the Mac sessions, let's run some commands to make sure it's configured as what we expect. First, show the group 1 and 2 situation. Show switch port protected 1. Yeah, it has 13 and 15 ports. Group 2. Yeah, 17 and 19. Let's check the status the other way. Let's show each interface. I want to show the port 13. Let's see whether it is in group 1. Yes, true in group 1. Port 15. Yes. Port 17. Yeah, for group 1 is false. But what about group 2? Yes, it's true. Perfect. Then the last one, 19, group 2. Yes, we are done with the backend configuration. There's one thing I need to mention. You can only add a interface to one group. You cannot add single part to multiple different groups. Okay, we are ready to test whether the system works as we expect. On the screen, I show you 4 windows for the 4 different clients. By the way, the reason I mixed the choice of Linux virtual machine and the physical Mac machine is just I happen to have the 4 physical ports ready. Okay, we are ready to test their connectivity. Let me find out their IP address first. I found the 4 individual IP addresses. For Mac, I simply display the network connection. For Ethernet, this is the IP address. We can start the testing. For the client 1 and 2, they are not supposed to ping each other successfully. Yeah, the ping failed. For client 3, I'm not supposed to be able to ping the Mac machine, which is client 4. Let me try it. It failed as well. But from client 1, I should be able to ping client 4 because they are in 2 different isolation groups. They should be able to communicate with each other. The MAC IP address is 1.211. Yes, so from client 1, we are able to ping client 4. Same thing from client 3. Let me try client 2, which is 1.44 IP address. Yes, I'm able to do that. Perfect. We already proved the 2 group settings. They work. Each isolation group only limit the traffic within that particular group. Before we finish this video, let me do one last thing. From the CLI, let me disable the 2 groups. No switch port protected, and then followed by the group ID. No switch port protected. For group 1, I want to remove it. For group 2, I want to remove it. Okay, the 4 clients, they should be able to ping each other freely. Kill the first one. This time, let me ping client 2 again from client 1. Okay, so right after I remove the group 1, I'm able to ping client 2 from client 1. Okay, so that's it for the 3rd section of this video. Let me summarize what we discussed. In first section, we discussed the most common simple scenario. We do it from the UniFi controller UI. We simply enable or disable port isolation status. It works as expected. Then we tried a complicated scenario involving multiple switches. We successfully achieved the isolation among multiple switches. And in the 3rd part, we tried several CLI commands, successfully configured multiple isolation groups. Okay, thanks for watching.